Hi everyone, I decided to do a more spontaneous and personal video for this final week. I thought, uh, given everything that's going on, a little bit more of a human connection, face to face, as much as we can get, would be appreciated. So bear with me as I make mistakes and errors that I won't be able to smooth out as I normally do in these videos. So this week, I'll just do a little bit of new material, and then we'll talk a little bit about an overview of what we've done in this course. So um, the last bit of new material is to talk about what do we do when the data we're looking at doesn't work for the various types of tests we come up. In particular, what happens if it's not normally distributed or not normal enough for tests like ANOVA. In that case, we can turn to what's called a non-parametric test. We've already used one, in fact, Pearson's chi-squared test. And the point of a non-parametric test is it basically makes no assumptions about how the data is distributed. It doesn't assume that it even has a useful mean or variance, that it's normally distributed, whatever. So if you don't have a good idea of what your distribution, what your data looks like, how it's distributed, then you can use a non-parametric test. If you do have some good idea, like with our normally distributed data, then you should use the appropriate test. You should always use the test that matches the information you've got. And in this case, we're going to use tests where we just don't have enough information to know how the data is distributed. So if you want to compare two samples and see if they look the same somehow, but they're not normally distributed, so you can't use a t-test, you can use what's called Mann-Whitney U-test. And it works in a very similar way, but here it looks at the median rather than the mean. And you don't need to test for homoscedasticity in advance because that itself is a parameter. And the whole point of a non-parametric test is that you don't assume anything about the parameters. So all you do is you just take your two samples and you run them through the Mann-Whitney U-test. And if your data are paired, when it was normally distributed, we would use a paired t-test. And there's a paired version of the Mann-Whitney U-test called the Wilcoxon signed rank test. And this can also be used for testing goodness of fit if you have a single sample. So to summarize, we've got, and all of these are implemented in R with the Wilcox test command. And so we've got three versions of these. One is if you have unpaired data or paired data, and you're doing two samples, so you have an X and a Y. And if it's paired, you have paired equals true, and otherwise you leave it off. That's the default assumption. And if instead you only have one sample, a single X, and you want to compare it to some particular median mu, then you use the Wilcox test as well. And this is a goodness of fit to a particular median. Now we also have that's if we've got one or two samples. If we have three or more, if it were normally distributed or normal-ish, we would use a Oneway ANOVA or a pairwise t-test, and there are non-parametric versions of these. For Oneway ANOVA, what we would use is a Kruskal-Wallis H-test. That is our omnibus test, and that tells us whether or not there seems to be some deviation between the three or more samples that we have. And it has a similar setup to how we use an ANOVA. And this is with the Kruskal test command. Once you do that, then you want to look at the appropriate post hoc test. And there's various ones that we can use, but the simplest, most straightforward to use is again the Mann-Whitney U-test, but this time a pairwise version of it. Just like we have the pairwise t-test, there's a pairwise Mann-Whitney U-test when we don't have normally distributed data. And it's got a lot of the same options and possibilities that the pairwise t-test does. And again, we use the same kind of structure that we use for pairwise t-test. And by default, it uses home Bonferroni correction, which is a better version of Bonferroni correction. But if you want it to use Bonferroni correction, that can be done with setting that option in the command. There are other methods. One really interesting way of working with deviant data is to transform it. Maybe the data itself isn't normally distributed, but if you take the log of all of your data points, the logarithm, those logarithms will be normally distributed. And then you can work with that and then transform everything backwards after you've tested for equal means or variance or whatever. There's a general, powerful, popular method for doing this kind of transformation called the Box-Cox power transformation. It's too complicated for us to talk about here, and there's lots of different ways to do it, but it's a really interesting way of working with data that as itself is deviant, but all you have to do is use some sort of mathematical equation to transform the individual data points to a new set, and then that new set turns out to be normally distributed. And it's really cool how that works. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about when we've worked with data that is paired, you've got two samples and each data point is matched across the samples, there's a more general term for this called repeated measures or within subjects. And all this means is that each subject, each entity that you're measuring gets measured multiple times under different conditions. So you might measure a patient before treatment, 1 week after treatment, 2 weeks after treatment, and 3 weeks after treatment. And you're measuring the same patients every time. This would be repeated measures or within subjects. You're looking for what happens to your subjects over time or across different treatments. If instead you're measuring some group of people before treatment, and then some completely different group of people 1 week after treatment, and then another group of people 2 weeks after treatment, that is independent measures or between subjects. As it turns out, within subjects or repeated measures is a more powerful method in general, but you can only use it if you've designed your experiment that way. So if you go into your experiment knowing that you can take measurements at various points in time or for different circumstances for the same entities, that's what you should do. Sometimes you don't have that option. Sometimes you run your experiment, the first condition in 1 year, and then you run the next one next year with maybe different people. In that case, you have a between subjects design. So when you're working with two samples of data, that's just called paired data. Repeated measures and paired data are the same for two samples. For 3 or more, you can have the same interdependency across individuals. And if you're doing an ANOVA, this would be called repeated measures ANOVA or R ANOVA. And then there's a non-parametric counterpart of this called the Friedman test. So it's like the Kruskal-Wallis H test, but with repeated measures rather than assuming independence across your entities. That's it for the new material. There's not a lot here. It's mostly just sort of a teaser for the kinds of things that you might get into if you were to do statistics beyond this course, especially things like the I forgot, the nonparametric tests. Those are things that are going to crop up a lot because you're not always going to have normally distributed data. And then things like the Box-Cox power transformation can pop up if you've got a particular type of data you're working with where the underlying distribution isn't normal until after you've applied a mathematical equation to it. And then repeated measures, that's something you definitely want to keep in mind as you go forward designing your own experiments. If you have the option, you should do a repeated measures within subjects design in your experiments. So that's all the new material. All that's really left is to just talk about everything that we've done really up to this point. And I don't want to dive into this too much because most of this overview was designed with having a final exam in mind. And since we don't have a final exam, there's not a lot of point in really meticulously going through this overview. But I hope that you find these pages useful in the future. I know I've had students come back to me after this course. They've lost their notes and now they're doing statistics in some experiment. They're like, can you give me those notes, the ones from the last lecture? Because being able to track down what type of tests to run is a really useful feature of these notes. So I highly recommend holding on to these, especially if you're going to go further into linguistics and further into doing experimental work and statistical analysis. So yeah, every test that we talked about in this second half of the course is listed there. And then there's a brief summary here of some more types of tests that we didn't actually do, but which you'll see in different versions with different types of data. So multi-factor ANOVA, MANOVA, R ANOVA, Friedman test, which we just talked about. Variety of different tests here. I don't tell you much about how to do some of these. Hopefully you would be working with somebody who does, or you can look these up if they become relevant. There's also a review of how hypothesis testing works and how that relates to confidence intervals. And then finally, a short glossary of basic R commands. So there's basic arithmetic commands, all the ones that we've used, as well as how to work with certain types of objects in R. And some of the commands in R that are relevant to probability and descriptive statistics. And that's it for the course. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope those of you who came in with anxieties or phobias about math and statistics have come away realizing that you can do it. The same for computer programming. You have learned a programming language. Many of you probably didn't know one before, and now you can write simple programs in the R programming language. And you should be proud of yourselves for having been able to do that. It's kind of cool to learn these programming languages. And there's a lot you can do with R. Now that you have these basics, you can move forward and do even more. So that's it. I hope you're all doing well, staying healthy, and making the best of the situation that you're in. I know that this has been tough. Please also do fill out the course evaluations on Quercus. Those are really important for helping me tweak the course, figure out what works and what doesn't. This is the third time I've taught it, so it's pretty well smoothed out. But you know, any bit of advice, even things that it's just like, this was great, I'm glad you do this, thanks for doing that, keep doing it. That's always good to hear, because then I know that what I'm doing is working and the choices I've made have been good in how I designed the course. And I realize that, you know, these past 3 weeks have not been ideal. And I wish that the course could have ended in person. And unfortunately, we're in the situation we're in, and I made the best of it. I hope you're making the best of it. And that's pretty much it. I wish you well and good luck in all the rest of your courses. Bye.